Future War is a survey of new developments in combat technology, a dazzling presentation of enhanced human soldiers, robot combatants, hypersonic vehicles, and more. It also discusses the fact that the cost of these highly efficient means of conducting war is potentially as great as their benefit, if we don't fully understand their power. Changing the way we fight war, Latiff argues, these new technologies must also change the way we think about war. P.W. Singer, author of Wired for War, says this book is a useful guide to weighing the many dilemmas that won't go away anytime soon, the moral implications of our changing weapons and changing wars. Robert Latiff is highly qualified to talk about this topic. He is a retired U.S. Air Force Major General and one of the nation's foremost experts on the role of technology in war and intelligence, as well as the Director of Intelligence Community Programs at George Mason School of Engineering. Please help me welcome him to Politics and Prose.
Pardon my inability to get around. So let me begin by thanking Politics and Prose for being Politics and Prose. I think you all know what I'm talking about. I also would like to thank Politics and Prose for hosting this. And last but not least, thank everybody who came tonight. Just a few very specific introductions. That's my wife, Dale, here. My son, Paul, and my daughter, Susan, who figures very prominently in the acknowledgements. Again, thank you for your interest. As a retired Air Force general, I've probably given thousands of speeches. But doing a book signing is like getting up in front of people and talking about your baby. You know, it's a little embarrassing, but I enjoyed writing it. Not only did I enjoy writing it, I really thought it was important to write. And so I hope you will find it as interesting as I did. As my graduate student daughter often says, actually doing the research for something like this is really pretty amazing. So I also appreciate the folks who did the blurbs on the back of the book. I knew a few of those folks well, and one of them not so well. But I want to highlight what General Clapper, or Director Clapper, had to say, and that was talking about truth to power. And if anybody's been watching the news lately, people like General Mattis and General Buchanan and a few others, General Dunford, have actually been saying what they think. And I think that's really a good thing. So tonight I'm going to talk about 3 topics. I've been told that 15 to 20 minutes is probably the most people can take. I'm going to talk about why I wrote the book, how I came to write the book, because I think that's a pretty interesting story, and just a few of the themes, and then open it up for question. I think that'll probably be more important. So in case anybody hasn't figured it out from the minute I opened my mouth, I'm from southeastern Kentucky. So as you might expect, I grew up as a very conservative hometown, product of the Sputnik era. So I was all about science. I was most interested in 2 things, space and nuclear weapons, right? And so you have to understand the era. So actually I got into Notre Dame, studied physics, and realized after a little while there I couldn't pay for it. I was going to have to quit. And the Army stepped in, Army ROTC stepped in and offered me a scholarship. And so I was able to complete my education, so great for the Army. I was only going to stay 4 years. Ended up staying 32, not in the Army, but trained for the infantry. I learned all about how to fight in Vietnam. I got one of my friends here tonight who actually did fight in Vietnam. Was an airborne, jumped out of airplanes. Physicist jumping out of airplanes, but and I stayed for my PhD. Notre Dame requested that I stay for my PhD. The Army strangely enough, agreed. And then by the time I went on active duty, Vietnam was pretty much over. And so I went to Germany. It was on the Fulda Gap. And so people ask me when I started thinking about these topics, right? So here I am on the Fulda Gap facing 100 divisions of Soviet soldiers and thinking to myself, this is really crazy. And we were doing some really stupid things like tweaking them. And they tweaked us back. And then after that, took command of an organization that had, and I had to sign for several hundred nuclear weapons. So when they came across the border, we're just going to nuke them. And that made me wonder. I was going to have to give these things out when the balloon went up, and I was wondering to myself, this is really strange. You know, you're going to participate in a nuclear war. That made me think. Taught at West Point for a few years, did some Air Force research, and then participated in the Star Wars program, President Reagan's Star Wars program. Another one of my friends here who spent some time in that. That was a lot of fun, but really when you look back at it, it wasn't never going to work. But didn't make me think too much. Then I commanded Cheyenne Mountain, the underground facility out in Colorado. We fought nuclear war every night. We trained for nuclear war every night. And that one was also, I had some responsibilities. I'll just leave it at that. If we ever went to war, I might have to do something. And I thought about that a lot. So I did a lot of thinking. And then on to the National Reconnaissance Office where we built spy satellites. So I went back and started thinking about why did I start thinking of these issues. So back in grad school during Vietnam, I really didn't think much about it. I mean, from an era which we basically did what we were told, right? But I did, if anybody who here is a historian reads history, I did read a very impactful book called Street Without Joy by Bernard Fall. If you haven't read it, if you read it during the Vietnam era, you'd read all about what the French did. That made me think a lot. Fast forward to the Gulf War. Then I really started thinking about these topics. The first Gulf War, the television war, the CNN war. We probably saw 100 times or 1,000 times those bombs going through the windows and the green tracer bullets, and we were good. We had great weapons. But you would have thought that we won World War III. We came back from that conflict and gloated. And it was about the time the fall of the wall, fall of communism, about the same time period, and we gloated some more. And then the years following that, we went in everywhere. The military just kept getting deployed. And then finally came 9/11. I was, at the time of 9/11, I was a one-star. Post 9/11, I'll just shorten it by saying post 9/11, I thought we went a little bit bonkers, a little bit crazy in our response to 9/11 and the things we did, things like torture and kidnapping and warrantless wiretapping and all of the things that came out at that time. So that got me very concerned. Then, of course, I retired. I was working in the defense industry, which I didn't really care that much for, but and I got in touch with the folks at Notre Dame, and one thing led to another, and I developed a course for them to talk about the ethics of emerging weapons and new ways of fighting. A wildly successful course. So successful, in fact, that Notre Dame had me film a little 2-minute clip. Anybody who ever watches Notre Dame football, hopefully some of you, will see some of those clips. They did one on my course. Subsequent to that, Sam Friedman, the religion editor for the New York Times, actually came and sat in on my course, wrote an article about too much about me, not enough about the course, but then it got to the attention of the people at Random House, Knopf. I was contacted by them and asked if I would be willing to write a book. So I got to meet a fellow by the name of Jonathan Siegel, who was my editor. If anybody knows the editing or the publishing business, Jonathan is sort of a legendary editor. He taught me an awful lot about writing. And I like to say most people work their entire lives and dream of being able to publish a book with a major house, and this one fell into my lap, and I am forever grateful for that. So about the book, I don't know how many of you have read it yet, but there were some themes that generally go along with the individual chapters. So the first theme is we've got some really crazy technologies that are coming to the fore that are just going to revolutionize warfare. The second theme, the second chapter, is that anybody who's a historian will know that technology and war have been intertwined for literally centuries, millennia. War actually has generated some of the best technologies that we've seen, which is really kind of sad. The third theme goes along with the third chapter, is that we've always had laws of war and the theories of just war. These new technologies are really going to challenge some of those ideas of what it means to fight a just war. And then the last major theme has to do with the relationship between the public, our leadership, and the military. And I think that relationship is broken, and I go into quite a bit of detail there. So in terms of technology, war has been changing. You're going to keep me on time, right? Tell me when time's okay. War has been changing for a long time. But as you know, in recent years and decades, we've gone to guerrilla warfare, terrorism. Now we're talking about gray zone conflict, if anybody's heard that term. It's a combination of cyber warfare and information warfare and terrorism and political intrusions, perhaps. It's everything. It's troublemaking. Boko Haram is probably a good example of gray zone conflict. The conflict in Ukraine is probably another one. And then, of course, there's all this new technology, and I talk about several. One general area is information technology, artificial intelligence, autonomy, machine learning, all of these things having to do with advanced computers. Soldier enhancements, where we physically, pharmaceutically, maybe electronically enhance the human being. Neuroscience, using genetics, using virus technology. Then there's non-lethal weapons, which is kind of an oxymoron, but weapons that are intended not to kill but to hurt, which is a good thing, right? I mean, that's a good thing. Can be used in really bad ways. So we've got hypersonic weapons that reportedly against which there are no defenses. So that should kind of scare us a little bit. And then, of course, lasers. Lasers have been around for years. The old joke goes that lasers and weapons are going to be 5 years from now, and every year it's going to be 5 years from now. But it looks like we may be getting them soon. So my point in talking in that chapter, I briefly talk about it, there are a lot of advantages to these things, and we shouldn't overlook those. A lot of these new weapons are going to save our soldiers' lives, and that's a good thing. They don't have to do hard, dirty, dangerous kind of activities. We should do that. On the other hand, if our soldiers don't get hurt, then we're more likely to go to war maybe. And so there are pros and cons, and I talk about those in the book. I spent a lot of time in chapter 2. I told my wife when she read it, I said, that's going to be the boring chapter for you. No, that was chapter 5, but it's just a long history of war and weapons. And submarines, tanks, nuclear weapons. Then I get into the topic of, I like this one, seduction and addiction. We get seduced by technology. We've been seduced by technology in the civilian world so often. I like to use, when I give a PowerPoint, I always use a picture of the Apple store in New York when a new iPhone is coming out. It's taken from the air, and there is a line about a mile long of people waiting to get the new iPhone. Go up to one of them in line and say, why? Well, it's a new iPhone. Right? We're seduced by it. We don't understand it, but we're seduced by it. And there's a quote in there I owe to a friend of mine from Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb. He said something to the effect of, you know what, this technology is just so sweet. You just go ahead and do it and you worry about the details afterwards. That sounds a little bit like seduction to me, of the worst kind. And then I take on this whole concept of weapons cost. Now, understand, I was in the weapons business my entire career almost, with the exception of being in the infantry. And I think weapons are important. Without a strong military, we can't back up the things we want to do, but we spend a lot of money. People look at the number, and they never really put the number in the context of, we're talking about on the average of $500 billion a year. $500 billion in a year. Of that, a couple of $100 billion are spent on weapons, and on that, $60 billion or so spent on research. So that's a lot of money. We spend more for defense than the next 7 countries combined. That's not to say that we shouldn't. It's to say that we could spend less. We could spend it more smartly. And if we had a better military strategy, we might not need as many weapons. And I also point out, by the way, that we are the biggest proliferator of weapons in the world. We sell $10 billion worth of weapons to some really, I won't say odd countries, but we sell a lot of weapons to other countries. Russia is a distant second. And then I take on the society and the military. I talk about arrogance. I believe, and many people I've talked to believe, that our technology is so good. It really is so good that we think we can just kind of go in and shoot them up and everything will be great. We learned in the Iraq War that wasn't the case. Remember shock and awe? Shock and awe, we really shocked and awed them. Didn't work out too well for us. Then I talk about the media. I like the media, by the way. I think the media is really important. This whole business of fake news is kind of silly. But the media often aggrandizes war. American Sniper and what are some of the other, they make war kind of, you can sit, Americans get to sit in an air-conditioned theater and watch war. They don't really have to do anything. I think the internet, God bless it, I love the internet. I wouldn't have been able to write the book without it, but it's a pretty dangerous thing. Then I take on the subject of deliberate ignorance, and it kind of goes all the way back to the discussion of technology. Notwithstanding a lot of efforts on the part of a lot of good people in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, we still are way, way down the list when it comes to public knowledge of technology. And so when a defense industry comes and says, you really need this, everybody says, yeah, okay, we'll take one of those. And they really don't think too much about it. Not only that, there are people who don't want to know, which I find really unusual. You know, people who don't believe in, and there are some probably here maybe, don't believe in climate change, don't believe in vaccines, don't believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, and don't want to believe. They don't want the facts. And then my last major point in that book is that there is a real chasm between the military and the public. We have an all-volunteer military. A congressional research report said that in 70 years we've deployed the military 64 times or 65 times or something like that. Great. On the average of once a year. They have no knowledge. It doesn't affect them. There's a quote in there from a soldier that said, you know, there are no bond drives, no taxes. And I felt like I was going on a camping trip. Nobody else came. So the military is out of sight and out of mind. I honestly believe that we issue these threats, and who is going to stand up and actually take those threats to fruition? It's not going to be the American public. It's going to be the all-volunteer military. So I have some great ideas about how to fix all of that. Maybe one of those ideas was my own. You know, I give credit in the book to, but having an authorization for the use of military force would be a good place to start. Make congressional people go on the record as to whether or not they want to go to war. Make the American public go on the record. Educate people. We've tried with STEM. I'm talking about educating people about the military, and there are some examples in there. Someone asked me a couple of days ago whether or not I thought we should go back to a draft. And I think it'll never work. It'll never happen. But maybe national service, some form of national service. And then trying in some way, the advanced nations, the United States, Russia, China, Western countries, India, you know, advanced nations could do a lot to create non-proliferation treaties for some of these technologies. Artificial intelligence, virus modifications. If we could stem the proliferation of some of this stuff, we might be in a better shape. And then I conclude by talking about the fact that we pay a lot of lip service to our military. I can recall several years ago, my daughter will remember this, I was wanting to write an essay called, "What Color is Your Ribbon?" Because ribbons were sprouting up on SUVs all over the place. And people felt good about that, support the troops. I would go through an airport in uniform, and then afterwards, you know, thank you for your service. I really appreciate that, but it didn't affect people. And I say that not only do we not respect our military, I think we disrespect our military. If you're talking to me and I ignore you, I'm disrespecting you. And by ignoring it, I think it's a form of disrespect. So I'm hoping that this book, I'm hoping millions of people will read it, but I'm hoping that it will help start a national conversation on this topic. And I don't know if I hit 20 minutes or not, but pretty close? Okay, great. Thank you for listening. I'd love to take some questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, and certainly one of the comments that almost cries out for a elaboration on your part, to me at least, is the comment that the relationship between the military and the people, and in parentheses, our government, our leaders, is broken and needs fixing. Could you elaborate? I mean, I think we could all, you know, can think of possible aspects of that, but I'd like a little more on that if you were willing.
Well, I think current issues tell us a lot about that. Well, for instance, the number of people in the U.S. Congress with any kind of military background is pretty limited, right? The military leaders don't educate, or civilian leaders don't educate themselves about the military. They basically turn to the military and ask the questions. And if they don't get the answer they like, then they basically do what they want anyway. So I think the civilian leadership, with some exceptions, and frankly, General Mattis is an exception, General McMaster is an exception, but the civilian leadership, with few exceptions, don't really even understand the military. I can't tell you the number of times as a senior Air Force officer when I would brief congressmen. As a matter of fact, I was briefing a congressman, and I tried to actually get into some discussions, and I was told that he was out of time and he had to go to another meeting. So there's very little interest in learning about the military, and of course on the public side, it's just terrible. I mean, you ask of pretty much anybody from the public, with the exception of the reading public, and they don't know much about the military either. And so when you don't know about something, it's kind of hard to make any informed decisions about it. I don't know if that helps at all. But yes, sir.
Hi, thanks for your talk. As he left office, General Eisenhower warned about the military-industrial complex. And of course, the figures that you suggest, the expenditures on the military, suggest that this is very big industry. So when you talk about the military, which is the dog and which is the tail? Is it the industry side of it? When the president talks about spending more on the military, is it really featuring the industrial side that's pushing even the involvement in wars, that benefits from the higher technology and the creation of that technology? Or where does that? So is the military the pawn of industry? Or what's that arrangement all about?
The answer to that question is yes. And it really is. I don't mean to be facetious, but I talk about the fact that Congress has a big role to play. There are jobs in the districts. Industry has a big role to play. And I was part of the revolving door. I went from being a military person to being in industry. And so there is that back and forth. I think my personal opinion is that industry wants to keep jobs. Congress wants to keep jobs in their districts. The civilian leadership creates strategies, military national strategies, that have little to do, or not enough to do with real threats. And as a result of those strategies, we get new weapon systems. And so I've actually read Eisenhower's speech all the way through several times. Not a lot of people finished it, but the one thing that he says in his speech, which I really resonate with, is that not only should we be concerned about the military-industrial complex, but we should also have some balance in our military and our social justice programs. I mean, he actually says not exactly those words, but he calls for a lot more balance than we're seeing today. So, thank you.
Thanks for your talk.
Yes, sir.
My question is similar to the previous one. I read a book, and I don't remember the author or the figures, but essentially the hypothesis of the book is half of the American economy is in some way primarily or secondarily related to the military, and that for this capitalist, militaristic country to survive, it must always be in a state of war, that we're always on a war economy. What are your comments about that hypothesis?
I don't know that I could sign on to the hypothesis without actually reading the book and seeing the numbers. I think there is some truth to the point that the military economy, it's not only the primary economy, it's in the secondary and tertiary. It affects a lot of people. Things like military bases. Why will Congress not let us close military bases? They're not needed because there are economies that spring up around a military base. So I think the answer to your question is partially yes, but I would love to read the book and get the figures. So
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. It's inspiring.
Thank you.
I recently heard a briefing by the director of the National Intelligence Council who talked about real threats.
Right.
And you've just used that term. We're all hearing about North Korea now. And could you address that a bit and talk with us about real threats as you see them?
Well, a real threat has two components. One is capability. The other is intention. Right. So, it's pretty easy for us to determine who has capabilities. We've got satellites and all kind of things and spies, and what's harder to figure out is who has the intentions. So, Russia has a lot of capability. Do they have an intention of attacking and threatening the United States? Or do they just want to be on par with us? Now, you can set aside the political intrusions, but China, boy, they have just grown like crazy in technology and weapons and aircraft carriers and space systems. It isn't clear to me that they want to attack us. As a matter of fact, I'm fairly sure they don't. So capabilities are one thing, intentions are another. To your point about Korea, that's a great question. I wish I had the answer to it. What I do know is they don't have quite the capabilities. We clearly could overwhelm them very easily. It would be a really messy affair. If you listen to them talk, they have the intentions. But I'll kind of go on my soapbox here. Threatening is not helpful. So we should be the adult in the room.
That was the follow-up question. Yeah. When you talk about the chasm between civilian leadership and military, and your effort to brief civilian leadership, and we don't have time for that. I have to be on to another meeting. Do you believe that in this day and age there is a relationship that matters between our civilian leadership and the military?
Well, I've said that I wanted to try to stay out of politics on this, but I honestly, I feel good, even though they're both a little bit warlike. I feel good about the fact that we have some very adult people in the Secretary of Defense and the National Security Advisor, and actually I'm even a little bit impressed, surprisingly so, with the Director of National Intelligence and the Director of CIA. They both have kind of surprised me a little bit, positively. So while we still have a few left before they resign, I think we're probably okay.
I hope you're distributing your book to all of them.
I wish I could.
Excellent.
Thank you for your question, though.
I'd like to follow up on the first question, which relates to the issue of our understanding of the military, which you say is woefully inadequate. What are some of the specific aspects of the military that you think we the people need to know more about, better understand, have dialogues with military leaders about?
A good question. A great place to start would be an understanding of the laws of armed conflict. Really, what constitutes a proper way of fighting war? That's a stretch, asking the American public to understand that, but understanding the constraints under which the military has to operate. Money, transportation, understanding the demands that are placed on individual soldiers and their families. It's the president or the decision makers can basically just say, I want to deploy 10,000 troops to Afghanistan, and then off they go. Well, that's a huge demand, A, on the military unit itself, and B, on the families, and there's a lot of money involved, and the American people kind of like, oh, okay. Well, all right, well, you know, the overseas contingency operation funds this year, I think, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but something like $60 billion so for operations overseas. Ask 99% of the American public how much it costs for us to operate in all these overseas locations. I guarantee you not a one will be able to tell you. So it's just an understanding. Should they? I don't know. But, you know, they can't tell you the difference between an Army brigade and an Air Force wing or a Navy battle group. And these are young men and women who are out there doing this for them, and they don't have the first understanding of what it's required. And I think if they knew more about the demands that that all of these deployments were taking on the young soldiers, they would be maybe a little more vocal with their decision makers and their congressmen about, no, I don't think that we want to send another 5,000 troops to Afghanistan. Or if you do, explain it to us as to what it's going to do for us. So that's a long answer, but
Well, it's a complex question.
it's a
isn't it?
complex
Yes,
question. Thank you for that. I can stay here all night, and I would be happy to. Yes. That second point, I think, is a good point. The one value that nuclear weapons have, knowing that we now have them, of course, and you can't get rid of them, is that people are so darned afraid to use them that we haven't since Japan. But to your first question, let me just give a couple of examples. Artificial intelligence and autonomous systems all kind of go together. Inserted into a drone, like the ones we fly today, those are all with a joystick. Right? But put artificial intelligence and machine learning and autonomy into a drone. Let the drone make the decision. Oh, I see a target over there. I think that's a legitimate target. I'm going to go kill it. And technology is pretty good. 99.9% of the time it will be right. But you don't want to be that 0.1% where the machine gets it wrong. So, machines, it's coming, whether the DoD says it is or not, it is coming, that machines are ultimately going to end up making decisions to kill people. On the ground, as a great example, is if there are companies out there who are talking about robot-human teams. So think of a platoon of infantry. Actually, I have an example in the book. A platoon of infantry with about half young soldiers, like my friend here, and half robots, right? And they come under fire. And the robot is doing a really great job, and the poor soldier isn't. Is the robot going to give up his life to save a soldier? Certainly in combat, soldiers look at each other and they depend on each other. They trust each other. I got your back, right? You think a robot's going to have your back? And that time is coming when we have robots and humans all in the same unit, and it's going to present a real different unit dynamic. So, enhanced soldiers. There are the Defense Department has been working for years on how do you physically enhance a soldier, make him stronger, make him faster, make him be able to go without food and water for long periods of time. there are real ethical issues associated with stuff like that, and they know it. And then the last one is they're working on neural implants for good reasons, therapeutic reasons. But they've now learned that they can get into your brain, literally get into your brain, by stimulating other nerves in your body. So there's a lot of work going on in being able to stimulate certain areas of the brain. That's way, 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 way out into the future, but that's how some of these technologies are going to be used. I don't know, does that answer your question at all? Sort of? Well, I'll be happy to talk more about it if you want. So. Yes, sir.
Hi, can you go into a little bit about the events at the U.S. Embassy in Cuba and what may have happened there?
Boy, I would actually be speculating, but let me answer it this way. In the book, I talk about non-lethal weapons, right? And there are all kinds of non-lethal weapons. One of those, you got lasers and you've got RF energy. One of those kinds of non-lethal weapons is a sonic weapon. And the one that's used most often and most well-known is sonic weapons that are on board transport ships to repel pirates. Very loud, very high-pitched. But if you lower the frequency, low frequency sound can interact with the organs in the body. And, well, I mean, you think about it, if you just think about your own self, you're next to a train track or something, when it rolls by, you feel that sort of the shaking. It can induce nausea. The way I know that they actually do induce nausea is with lasers. Certain types of lasers flashing can cause you to get sick. But I think sonic could probably be just as, I don't know that for a fact, but sonic waves do interact with the organs of the body. Okay? I'll be interested to read the report. So. Well, yes, sir.
As a private citizen, I'm concerned about military spending. The United States have been in Afghanistan for the last 16 years, and I keep asking myself, what do we have to show for it? And then this current president decides to send another 4,000 troops to Afghanistan. It's my thinking that in the end, the only thing the public will get is an Afghanistan wall. Do you think the United States should continue to be in Afghanistan? It seems to me it's a kind of Pyrrhic war. They don't like that word Pyrrhic, but that's what I think about it.
Pyrrhic victory?
Yes.
Okay, great question. I will also point out to you, you probably know my leanings, but I will also point out to you that our previous president sent additional troops to Afghanistan as well. And there are, I think, some legitimate reasons to have a small presence there and just trying to help the Afghans. The question was, were we going to stay in Vietnam forever? Well, my answer is probably not, but I don't know how it will end. But you raise a larger question that it is up to the American public to demand answers to these questions. You tell us that it's going to make us safer if we invade Iraq. Well, tell us how it's going to make us safer, okay? You tell us it's going to make us safer if we threaten Kim Jong-un. Well, tell us how. You know, the American people, I think, if you've talked to them rationally, many of them will understand what you're saying, but I don't, as part of this business with the leadership, they don't communicate. They don't have to communicate with the American people about military. If we're not going to sign an AUMF, and it's not going to be any additional taxes and all those other things, then the American people really have no stake in it. And so nobody ever tells us how it's going to make us safer. And I believe that if we were to do that, and it was a legitimate reason, the American people would go along with it. Say, yeah, sure. But it doesn't happen. So.
Just curious, as command and control has gotten more sophisticated over the years, decision-making seems to get more and more centralized. And you're talking about decision-making now with autonomous vehicles coming along. Do you think the centralization of decision-making is a trend that's going to continue, or will it start decentralizing and moving back out towards the battlefield?
I think the answer to that is, again, yes. Soldiers will be instrumented. They're already tied back to the states in every way conceivable. And so while theoretically the combat commander on the ground has autonomy, he's always being watched. So I think centralized command and control will remain, except when there's no longer any communications. So we know that cyber warfare is getting to be a huge thing in both civilian and military, as well as electromagnetic warfare, jamming, okay? So when you don't have communications and you can't communicate, that's when the autonomy, says, okay, I can't ask anybody a question, so here I go. So it's a multiple answer question. I think centralized command and control will continue. It's just too easy for the people back in Washington to run the war. So. Yes, sir.
Yes, I enjoyed your presentation. It was very edifying. I was curious about your comment regarding the media. You said you like the media. Can you explain why you like the media in light of surveys from independent pollsters, mind you, that are evenly sampled, saying that the media is held in low regard?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
The media is held in low regard by most people, particularly independents like myself.
When I say I like the media, I like the concept of a free and open press, okay? I like independent media. I like National Public Radio. I like WETA. I like all of those things. The media has a really, really important role to play. Have they done it very well? Not on your life. We're too concerned about entertainment. We're too concerned about ratings. We're too concerned about ad sales, all of those things. But the media is hugely important, and without it, I think we'd be in a real mess. So my recommendation, which is only about that long because there's nothing we can really do about it, is that we really need to push for an independent media. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but
sort of. Maybe Hannah Arendt was right, if you know who Hannah Arendt was.
Oh yeah, the banality of
evil.
She
said, "Let the greater truth prevail." I don't see that much in the media, frankly. I don't see much truth coming from the media when it comes to balanced, dispassionate reporting about developments in the States or overseas. And that's just my opinion.
I agree with you.
And it's very distressing.
Yeah, I agree with you in many cases. I mean, there's one on one side, one on the other, one in the middle, and then you've got independent radio and television. There are very good outlets. I don't think we need to paint every media outlet with the same brush. 90% of them are pretty rotten, but there are some good ones. So. That's a really great question. It really is a good question. Are there briefings that the military does for people on the civilian side? And the answer to that is yes, but you have to look for them. And so the reason it was kind of interesting you asked, because next week I'm going to Dallas to talk about the book. Dallas-Fort Worth, Texas. Right? There's a World Affairs Council, and a lot of major cities have military affairs councils. It's particularly if there's a military base close by, and civilians are always invited to come and see the base and hear. Hey, what you hear is kind of Chamber of Commerce stuff, but it's pretty good. It tells you what the military is up to and the kind of weapons they have and what they're doing. And websites are not too bad if you're willing to go on the websites, but it's a good question. There isn't enough out there, but there is some. So. Okay. Thank you very much. If it's not obvious, I'm passionate about it.